All right, it looks like we are ready to go live here. Let's just wait till the clock ticks over till 11 o'clock, and I believe that should do the trick. Let me turn my sound off over here so that you don't get feedback loop. We'll be ready to go. All right, everybody. I'm Tom Ballard, the Groundwater Guy. Welcome to Groundwater Talk Live. Our topic today is a follow-up from last week. We're going to talk about systematic utility management part 2. So we covered 5 attributes of systematic utility management last week. We're going to cover the remaining 5, and there's 2 that are very important in here. So that's what we're going to talk about this week. But before we get going, I ask everybody if they can like, comment, and share. It always helps to get the word out. It helps beat the algorithm, I guess, and get the word out when you share, when you like. And I do respond to all comments on LinkedIn and on YouTube. I respond to everybody's comments. And if you got any questions, please feel to drop them in there, and I answer those. So I try to answer everything. So thank you very much for that as we continue to grow our channel. All right, so let's start talking today. Last week we covered 5 attributes of a sustainable utility system, and we're going to cover the remaining 5 today. There's 10 total. We're going to cover the remaining 5 today. So let's just look at what those are. So last week we talked about product quality. We talked about customer satisfaction, financial viability, operational optimization, and employee and leadership development. So this week we're going to talk about 2 really important ones. It's going to be infrastructure strategy and water supply sustainability. And we're also going to talk about operational resiliency, community sustainability, and stakeholder understanding. Now those last 3, probably for a small water system, which is really what our focus is here, those might be a little esoteric in some of these areas. We're going to talk about them, but some of these things apply maybe to the larger water systems. But there's something to think about as we get into that. For instance, green infrastructure, those types of things might be better suited for a larger water system. But there may be people in smaller water systems that are in tune to that really want to look at that. So I included here just for the sake of completeness. All right, so let's dive into that. And let's go here. So key attributes of sustainable water utility part 2 is what we're covering today. So the first one is infrastructure strategy and performance. Very, very critical for any utility is maintaining your infrastructure. When we see the results all over the country, when you kick the can down the road, you don't do the maintenance, you don't understand what you own, you don't understand where things are in their life cycle, it really has dire consequences. It costs you a lot more money. So really understanding the condition and costs associated with your critical infrastructure assets, and I would really say beyond critical. I mean, we want to start with our critical assets. Obviously, those are the ones that where failure can create some issues for you, but we really want to eventually get to the point where we're assessing all our assets. So this is where the asset management plan comes in. That's really what we're talking about here is your asset management plan. So this plan's infrastructure investments consistent with your community needs, anticipated growth, system reliability goals, and relevant community priorities. So yes, your capital improvement plan ties in here. We did talk last week about financial viability, and so a lot of these things have related components to them. So your infrastructure strategy and performance is going to consist of the asset management plan and the related capital improvement plan or CIP. So we need to prioritize our assets. We need to understand the condition they're in, and we need to have the capital available at the right time to replace or renew those assets. All right, the next one is enterprise resiliency, this can get into some green infrastructure and those types of things. Like I say, that may not be totally relevant to small water system, but I'm including it here for the sake of completeness. So this ensures utility leadership and staff work together internally and coordinate with your external partners. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit too, to anticipate, respond to, and avoid problems. We want to proactively identify, assess, establish tolerance levels for, and effectively manage a full range of business risks. Now, business risks are going to include everything from injuries to sickness, and we really have to look at all those things in total, besides just what you may think of the risk of things breaking. That we've kind of covered that in the last section here with our asset management plan. But this is really looking at the health of the enterprise overall. And when we talk about enterprise, that is going to be the water utility in total. So we'll dive in when we get to the breaking this down a little bit section. We'll dive into that a little bit more. But we really want to look at the health of the system overall. We want to take care of our employees, make sure they're not getting sick, make sure they're not getting injured, and make sure we're not having excessive insurance claims. These all fold into the enterprise reliability attribute. All right, so community sustainability. We want to take an active leadership role in promoting and organizing community sustainability improvements through collaboration with local partners. So this is really where we get involved in our community. And a water utility, especially in a small community, it's going to be a big component of that community because everybody's going to know the water system operators, where the problems are. It's going to be hard to hide anything if you have problems, but we want to sustain the community too. And like it or not, it's not just a matter of providing water to the community, but it's being part of the community. So we want to manage our operations and the infrastructure, our investments to support economic, environmental, and social health of the community. Buying local is one way to do this wherever possible, but even contributing to the local Boy Scout troop or Little League baseball, those are all part of this same overall community sustainability attribute. So we'll dive into that a little bit more too. So water resource sustainability is a huge one. After all, a water utilities business is providing clean, safe drinking water. So the source of that water really is going to be a huge deal for us. We want to have the sustainability. We need to look at the long term. We need to look at the short term. And sometimes those things can be a little bit different how you approach them. So, but ultimately, we want to make sure that we have the water available when we need it, in the quantities we need it, and that we manage that sustainably. So we keep it going. We maintain that water supply. So if you have wells, what's really going to enter in here is making sure you do regular well rehab, well health checks to monitor the health of that well, and do your rehabs and your maintenance to keep those wells flowing. If you have surface water sources, a lot of the same things can apply. I mean, a little bit different approach for surface water. I mean, sometimes you have issues there with when you have surface water tends to have total organic carbon issues, which can lead to disinfectant byproducts. So those are things you got to kind of monitor and manage, and you don't want to get shut down because you're producing excessive disinfection byproducts, haloacetic acids, trihalomethanes. Those types of things can be detrimental to our system, and those generally are going to be restricted to surface water assets, and also resource recovery, water saving factors can come into play here. Do we have a plan to save water? And in places like California and other parts of the West, this is a huge component because we can have drought conditions where we need to move into the sustainability part where we save water. So that's going to fall on the utility, the water utility, to really manage that and make sure that that's being done. And we can track that at the utility because we can have some measures to track how much water we're saving based on how much we were using before versus now, and what efforts we're making to save water in the community. And so that's another component of this as well. So we need to understand role in the complete water cycle and integrate utility objectives and activities with other watershed managers and partners. So a lot of it comes down to the watershed. Excuse me, making sure there's no polluting activities going on. That's going to be working with other partners and landowners in the watershed, near our wells, near our surface water sources, to make sure we're not having any contaminating activities. So there's really a lot that goes into this. This is probably one of the that plus infrastructure is probably one of the more important components of the whole sustainable utility management approach, and I like to call it systematic utility management, because we're applying all these things together at the same time. So it's actually a whole system. But obviously, even in a whole system where you have 10 components, there are some of these components or attributes that are going to be more important than others. And water resource sustainability really definitely is one of those. So that's something we definitely want to look at, and it's a big one. And last of the five that we're covering today, stakeholder understanding and support. Now, a lot of small water systems, the manager's eyes glaze over when you start to talk about stakeholders and dealing with them, but they can actually be great allies. And the thing is, with stakeholders, it's really important not only to let them know when things are going right, but when things are going wrong as well, because there's nothing worse than having things go wrong, or where you've deferred maintenance, or whether your costs have gone up and you need to go to the stakeholders and the ratepayers and request a rate increase. And having that justification, having that communication up is going to be very, very important. And just letting them know what's going on, whether it's good, bad, neutral, just having that communication established. We'll dive into a little bit more on what that means, but really it's getting understanding and support from the stakeholders. So these are not only your customers, but also oversight bodies, so your regulators, other people in the community and in your watershed, um, and even things like the media. They're stakeholders. They're part of the community. So you want to have good stories from the media, or at least accurate stories is really what you want. So this is going to look at communication as far as rate structures, operating budgets, capital improvement programs, and risk management decisions. We haven't talked a whole lot about risk management, but that's an important component. Even for small water systems, managing your risk is a big deal. So we want to basically, what it comes down to is we want to have the stakeholders actively promote an appreciation of the true value of water and water services provided by the water utility. We want to have a joint effort together where we're working together instead of butting heads. And that's where communicating with the stakeholders really comes in, and building their support. A lot of that is going to be communication. So that's important to understand. All right, so performance measures. So we're going to take these five attributes, we're going to break them down a little bit, and we're going to look at performance measures. And as I mentioned last week, you can't measure what you don't track, and if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So a little extension of Peter Drucker's quote, and I like to use this because really, when it comes down to improving performance, we got to track and measure things, and that's how we're going to determine whether we're going to make improvements, whether we're backsliding, and really where we're at in things. And if you're just doing it by guess, then you're going to have problems. So having a system in place to measure your performance, for all these different areas is going to be very important. Now we'll see in some of these that some of these are basically we got some where we have KPIs or key performance indicators that you're actually calculating out, and others of these are going to be a yes or no question: are we doing this or not? So that's you'll see that here. So, all right, so. Going back to infrastructure strategy and performance, remember, this is going to be your asset management plan and your capital improvement plan. So probably the biggest component of systematic utility management is going to be asset management and the accompanying capital improvement plan. So we got the assets are really what make things work, and close behind that is our water resources, our sustainability there. But you can have the best water sources in the world, but if you don't have good distribution pipelines, treatment, storage, then it all goes for naught. So this, I would dare say, is probably the most important attribute of systematic utility management. All right, so we're going to break this down in a few different areas. First one is asset inventory and condition assessment. This really is the heart of your asset management plan. So this, in a nutshell, gauges a utility's efforts to assess assets and asset conditions as the first steps towards building a comprehensive asset management program or asset management plan, or AMP, as we like to call it, AMP. And you're going to want to start with your critical assets, defining your critical assets or those that are getting down towards the end of their life. But eventually you want to assess all your assets and understand when you're going to need to replace or renew those, how much it's going to cost you, not only in current dollars, but in future dollars, so you can start setting aside that money in your capital improvement plan. And that should be adequate to address your assets if everything is working together appropriately. So asset renewal and replacement. This measure really assesses asset renewal and replacement rates over time. So we're going to look at the lifespan of these assets. So really the approach we use is life cycle costing, is looking at the cost of the asset over its life. So its cost, its lifespan, its current condition, how many years it has left, and what it's going to replace to what it's going to cost to replace that asset, and when we're going to have to apply those costs. So that's all part of your asset management plan, but really we're categorizing all our assets and we're looking at renewal and replacement of those assets. And you're going to have a database, a spreadsheet. There are some complex and expensive programs out there. We recommend for small water districts, you start out with like a spreadsheet-based program that's easy to use, that everybody understands. And the important thing is not spending months understanding your software system as opposed to starting to collect and get the data in there. Even if it's a simple system, if you got it in a spreadsheet and you later decide to upgrade to one of these sophisticated asset management software programs, then that data will be there, and there's usually some import functions that you can bring that in. But the important thing is to start getting this stuff down on paper. We'll do some future shows on how you set these up. We don't have time today, but there are some examples out there online. But I'll do a future show on how we set up these programs. All right. Water distribution and collection system integrity. This is going to quantify the number of pipeline leaks and breaks. And really what we're getting at is what they call non-revenue water. NRW. So non-revenue water is what, and it's water that you've produced, that's going out there somewhere, probably through a leak or break. Sometimes it's people stealing your water. It's been known to happen more than you might think, but identifying that, getting it fixed. So one measure would be looking at quantifying the number of pipeline leaks and breaks, but just assessing how much water gets delivered to customers versus how much water you produced. And the difference then is going to be that non-revenue water. And generally it's good to track that down. If you have leaks and breaks, to track that down and get those fixed. We want to minimize non-revenue water because you're spending the money to produce that water, but you're not actually selling it. You're not getting any money back. And if you have a high percentage of non-revenue water, that's going to affect your utility finances. So infrastructure planning and maintenance, another huge area. This addresses planning for future infrastructure needs and ongoing maintenance of existing infrastructure. This is critical to overall infrastructure strategy and performance. It includes both predictive and preventive maintenance. This is where we see a lot of small utilities fall down. They have a budget shortfall, they kick maintenance down the road, and it comes back to bite them because once you start deferring maintenance, those costs pile up and they actually become more expensive to fix them later than it is to fix them now. So kicking the can down the road, sometimes we can't avoid that, but it's really to be minimized to the extent possible because it will turn around and bite you as it has many small water utilities. You got to keep up on the maintenance and planning. And I think last time we talked about customer satisfaction, we talked about complaints. Nothing gets more complaints than not having any water because of a pipeline break or because we didn't maintain that valve and we couldn't get water to these people, or low water pressure even. People will complain about that too. So if you're tracking your customer complaints like we talked about last week, then that lack of maintenance sometimes will bite you because things fail because you kick the can down the road too far. So this is a really big component of asset management plan and your capital improvement plan. So let's look at some KPI examples. KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. It's a term I've kind of borrowed from the financial field, but they are numerical calculations that we're using to assess certain things. So asset inventory, and by the way, these are just examples. I did a full show on doing key performance indicators, and I'll post that in the show notes, the link to that. But really, these are some examples. There's a lot more you can go through, but here's some examples to see what kind of coverage you actually have. So you can probably think of some more. These are just examples. So inventory coverage percent is 100 times the total number of critical assets inventoried within a reasonable period of time. Example, 5 to 10 years divided by total number of critical assets. So we're really focusing here on critical assets. And so we want to assess their condition and inventory them versus the total number of critical assets we have in our system. So part of our asset management plan when we start is going to be determining what our critical assets are. And that's a vital part of that and one of the early things we do. So we want to look at what the percentage is that we're looking at over a period of time versus our total critical assets and how we're categorizing things. So basically you're really looking and seeing, are we keep staying the course and getting these things renewed and replaced as needed and assessing their condition as we go along, because a critical asset is an asset that where failure is really going to bring down your system or substantially impact your system. And so those are things we really want to keep an eye on as well. So condition assessment coverage percent is 100 times the total number of critical assets with condition assessed and categorized into condition categories within a reasonable period of time, 5 to 10 years, for instance, divided by the total number of critical assets. So what we're really looking at here is, before we just looked at, are we looking at these critical assets? This KPI is a little more specific, where we're looking at that we actually assess the condition and categorize the condition of those critical assets over this 5 to 10 year period, however you want to define it. So that just kind of, once again, we look at that number every year, see if we're maintaining that, if we're getting better at it, and we take it from there. So asset renewal and replacement, here's a KPI example. Asset renewal and replacement rate is really 100 times the total number of assets replaced per year for each asset class divided by the total number of assets in each asset class. So this is broken down by asset classes. And asset classes can be things like valves, storage, wells. You're breaking it down into similar distribution pipelines. You're breaking it down into common areas. And we're going to see for distribution lines, how much are you replacing every year? And this doesn't totally get at the condition. We looked at that earlier. Are these critical assets and the condition? This just really looks at how we're doing on keeping our assets and replacing them on schedule. So we're not kicking the can down the road, and it's actually moving us forward. And we're doing this on a schedule. Water distribution collection system integrity, non-revenue water. We talked about this a little bit in detail already, but really what we really want to do is track that. So I don't have a specific KPI for you there. There are ways to measure that, non-revenue water versus a million gallons per day produced, those types of things, and you can monitor it that way. But whatever we do, we need to have a system in place to track the non-revenue water so that we can manage that. If non-revenue water numbers are going up, that's not a good sign. We really need to fix that because it's stealing revenue from us. However, it's happening: leaks, losses, unbilled, billing problems, those types of things. So those are things we need to track. So however you do it, you definitely want to track non-revenue water. Infrastructure planning and maintenance. Planned maintenance ratio by cost is 100 times the cost of planned maintenance divided by the cost of planned plus corrective maintenance. So we're looking at how are our expenditures going as far as planned maintenance as opposed to the cost of the maintenance we have planned and corrective maintenance. So our total maintenance versus how much we're actually doing. So are those numbers going up or down? That'll tell us how we're doing there. Now, enterprise resiliency, a little bit more esoteric and probably a little more boring for people, but it's something we got to look at too. Recordable incidences of injury or illnesses. So we really want to look at, how many, the workplace environment. Are you having more injuries than normal? Then you're going to want to fix that. That's obviously going to be an OSHA violation territory, and so you want to make sure that your injuries are under control. Some injuries, we like to say all injuries are avoidable. That's not always true. Accidents do happen, but we want to make sure that those are at a minimum. So we want to address incidence rates, can be used to show the relative level of injuries and illness and help determine the problem areas and progress in preventing these work-related injuries and illnesses. If people are getting ill in your office a lot, that there may be, maybe problems with the ventilation or something that you need to check out. So these can point to some potential problems. Insurance claims, it's a big deal. You want to have zero insurance claims. This is really your goal. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but you really want to minimize your insurance claims because obviously the more you use your insurance, the costs go up there and you may even get dropped. And that can be a big deal for small water systems. So you want to look at the number, type, severity of insurance claims to understand your insurance coverage, and do you have adequate insurance coverage? So that's important to take a look at that as well. Risk assessment and response preparedness. You're measuring whether utilities have assessed their all hazards, both natural and human caused, vulnerabilities and risks made, corresponding plans and you have made corresponding plans for your critical needs. So you're taking the risks assessment into account and you're making plans to deal with those risks. So this can be a very involved process or it can be a relatively simple process. And I'm advising for small water districts is you really start with the basics here and assess what your risks are. And you're going to know from the past what are your injury trends, what are your risks of failure in the water system where the treatment system doesn't work, and all of a sudden now you got a boil water order. These are risks that we need to assess and have plans for dealing with those. And like I say, it can be relatively simple or it can be really complicated if you're a bigger water district. So ongoing operational resiliency assesses utilities' operational reliability during ongoing or routine operations. So this is really the resiliency during ongoing situations. So not during high risk situations, but just ongoing. So is our trend increasing that we're breaking down more or not? So what is our resiliency there? Can we carry on if we need to? And operational resiliency during emergency conditions is the flip side. So during emergencies, do we have a plan in place? Do we have backup equipment? How do we get through an emergency? And having a plan in place, assessing our preparedness and having a plan in place to deal with that really provides resiliency in the enterprise. So let's look at some KPI examples here and injury and illness. This is just a measure here looking at the number of work-related injuries and illnesses times 200,000 divided by employee hours worked. So where does that 200,000 number come from? That is kind of a Bureau of Labor Statistics number that really looks at 100 employees working 50 hours a week, and so I think that number works out that way. So that's number of hours. So that number comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it gives you something to normalize, so you can compare your injury and illness record versus other water systems using kind of a standard type of numbers here. Insurance claims, you really want to look at the number of general liability and auto insurance claims per 200,000 employee hours worked. Once again, that's going back to that Bureau of Labor Statistics 200,000 employee hours number. So, but we really want to look at our insurance claims and just track that. For small water systems, you're probably going to know what that is off the top of your head, but it's still good to sit down and look at not only examining the number of claims, but the severity of those claims and if they're hitting the same areas all the time, then that area really needs some attention. All right. Risk assessment. So do you have an emergency response plan? And are you prepared for emergencies? So this is one of those yes or no things. Does the utility have an ERP in place, emergency response plan in place? Yes or no? If you don't, you might want to seriously consider that, even if it's a simple one. What do we do if this happens? And look at our risk for that and get that developed. There are people out there that'll draw that up for you, but you can probably take a good stab at it yourself if you're a small water system. You generally know what your risks are, but having a brainstorming session to really assess those is probably good. And then you want to train employees on that. So this measure here, number and frequency of ERP exercises per year. So 100 times the number of critical employees who participate in ERP exercises divided by the total number of critical employees. Critical employees, in this case, are going to be those that are going to respond to that emergency. So are we training those people adequately every year? So that just gives you the percentage of that. Operational resiliency, this is going to be uptime for critical utility components on an ongoing basis. So treatment systems, for instance, your chlorinator, you don't want that going down, so you want to look at the uptimes there. So what we want to do is come up with a percentage here, 100 times the hours of critical component uptime divided by the hours that critical components have the physical potential to be operational. Now, some things are critical components, they're not being run all the time, so we want to look at how often we would normally use those and then look at the uptime based on that. operational resiliency under emergency conditions. This has multiple components to it. So this is going to all flow back into your emergency response plan or EIP. So critical. So I've got a number of them here. I've got one spelled out here: critical parts and equipment resiliency. So the current longest lead time in hours or days for repair or replacement of operationally critical parts or equipment, calculated by examining repair and replacement lead times for all identified critical parts and equipment and taking the longest single identified time. So we want to look at what is our lead time to get replacement parts if we need them here, especially for critical ones. If it's a if it's a real long lead time, we may want to consider having backup parts on hand. You can look at the same thing for power resiliency. Do we have backup power supply? Do we have generators? Um, treatment chemical resiliency. Are we going to run out of chlorine? Critical staff resiliency. If somebody's out sick, do we have other critical staff that can take their place in an emergency? Treatment operations resiliency, that's just your day-to-day operations, and source water resiliency. Do we have backup wells or backup supply? If a well goes down for some reason, do we have backup water, sufficient backup water and storage combination that we can deal with loss of some of our source water capacity? All right, community sustainability. And this gets into some of these components that probably aren't really important to some small water districts, but some of these are. So watershed-based infrastructure planning. So this addresses efforts to consider watershed-based approaches so the entire watershed, where you're capturing your water from making management, when making management decisions affecting infrastructure planning and investment operations. This gets into some of the stakeholder involvement, those types of things, but we want to look at a kind of a holistic approach for the entire area. Green infrastructure addresses green infrastructure, which includes both the built and natural unbuilt environments. So do we have wetlands, for instance, for capturing unexpected runoff? Do we are we energy efficient? Those types of things. Now, energy efficiency can be classified as green infrastructure, but that's a wise move for anybody, no matter how small you are. One thing that's a little bit more esoteric and harder for smaller water systems is greenhouse gas emissions. This helps a utility understand and reduce their individual contributions to area greenhouse gas emissions. Probably not a huge consideration for really small water districts, and something that so some people may be interested in that. They may be conscious of these things and want to get involved in. And there are things you can do even as a small water system, but generally that's not going to be a huge priority for small water systems. Service affordability. This addresses drinking water and wastewater service affordability if you're doing both those. Which centers on community members' ability to pay for water services. You may be in a community that's a low-income community, and you really have to balance the cost, your rates for maintaining your water system versus what people can afford to pay. So it ends up being kind of a tightrope sometimes. You want your rates to reflect all your costs and your capital improvements. But sometimes you just can't you can't jack the rates up a much without trying to figure out some way to help people pay for water services. So if they're in area, there are financial considerations available for areas that are below mean household income requirements, and that might be something you can look at to offset some of these rates. So community economic development, once again, probably not a huge deal for small water systems, but still, you want the water system to play a role in the community economic development. There's probably some jobs there, And the other thing that really that people don't think about is the ability to serve of a water system is really important in attracting growth to an area. Are you going to have sufficient water for these new businesses coming in? Do you have that capacity? And if you're looking at expansion in the areas, can you plan out your capital improvement plan to make sure that you can expand the system to handle any anticipated growth in the area? So that is, even for small water systems, this can be a vital component. So here's some KPI examples, and some of these are going to be yes or no for the most part. Um, Watershed-based infrastructure planning. Does the utility employ alternative watershed-based approaches to align infrastructure decisions with overall watershed goals and potentially reduce future infrastructure costs? Taking into account maintaining the watershed versus the utility itself. Can you figure out ways to do less distribution lines and reduce your impact on the watershed? So do you have a plan for that? Yes or no? So green infrastructure, has the utility explored green infrastructure approaches and opportunities that are aligned with the utility's mandate, goals, objectives, and community interests? Yes or no? This may not even be on the radar for most small water systems, so I'm including it here for the sake of completeness. And there are people that are probably going to want to look at that even in small water systems, so I do include it here. Greenhouse gas emissions. In some places, you can buy your power from green sources in the utility. How they separate that out, I don't know. I kind of guess it's a little bit of a give and take here, but you can say that, and some places have they'll do some solar alternatives for some non-critical parts of their infrastructure, and so there are ways to do this. But I would hazard to guess that greenhouse gas emissions really are not a high priority for small water systems. Service affordability. This goes back to people's ability to pay. So the bill affordability is households for which rates may represent an unaffordable level. So we want to look at the percentage of those in our community, and then we're going to have to make plans to deal with that. So that's 100 times the number of households served for which an average water bill is X percent. Often 2 to 5% of median household income. Typo there. Divided by the total of number of households served. So you're going to look at what percentage of households in your community where the rates attain a certain level that is considered to be unaffordable. So you're going to have to assess what that is. In this case, 2 to 5% is generally considered to be the unaffordable level, or at least where people really have to strain to pay for water at 2 to 5%. So, you add on to that your food, your house payments, those types of things, and you can see where that number starts to come into play. So, and community economic development, change in the tax base, dollars or percentage change related to new water infrastructure, number of jobs created by utility infrastructure investments. These are basically numbers. They're not really a KPI per se, but you can look at changes in these things over time. Your change in tax base, are you growing? If your tax base is growing, then it may be time to see how that relates to your existing infrastructure, plan out more infrastructure, and how you're going to pay for that. You may have more capacity to pay for that if your tax base is growing. So, but balancing the needs versus the revenue coming in is a way to look at that. And then the number of jobs created, we want to go local wherever possible. So that's a number you want to track too. So water resource sustainability. So water supply adequacy is number one here. That assesses the short and long-term supply adequacy and explores related long-term supply considerations. You want to make sure you have both short and long-term plans for adequate water. So this, going back to the growth, this is going to take some of that into account. It's going to take into account aging wells or water sources. So you're going to want to look at all those things and make sure you have not only the short term but your long term water supply secured. Supply and demand management, that examines whether the utility has a strategy for proactive supply and demand management in the short and long term. So what is your drought response might be a good example of this. So do you have a plan to cut back on water use, restrict watering your lawns, or even rationing water if things get severe enough? And so that's balancing supply and demand management. So drought is probably a really great example of that. So Watershed Sustainability, this explores whether the utility has a strategy for proactive watershed management and partnerships to ensure an effective integration of the utility and watershed investment practices. And that's for overall performance. You're going to want to look at development in the area. You're going to want to look at safeguarding your water supplies. You're going to want to look at making sure you're not doing anything to impact the watershed as well. So this is looking at the watershed in whole. So water supply adequacy, short and long term, is really what you want to look for. So short term is just going to be a few years. Do you have adequate water supply there? Long-term water supply adequacy, we want to look at least 50 years. And we're building wells now that have 80-year, 100-year expected lifespans. And that's something you really want to look at. And that's where that life cycle costing comes in too. If you design a well for 100 years, you may want to, it may be more expensive up front, but your life cycle costs are going to be lower because you've done adequate design and construction that is going to make that last for 50 years. That's going to secure your long-term water supply. You're going to want to do regular maintenance and rehabilitation on your water supply sources, whether that's surface water or groundwater, and make sure that that is maintained for both the short term and the long term. And you really want to look at that. They work together, but you really want to look at those separately, just because they take some different factors into account. Supply and demand management. Does the utility have a demand management and demand reduction plan? Once again, this I go back to the drought example, and do you have a plan in place to reduce, or do you have a plan in place to reduce demand if necessary? Watershed sustainability. Here's an example. There's a lot of ways to look at that. I took wet weather impacts here as an example KPI. So flooding, community sewer overflows, sanitary sewer overflows, gallons of infiltrated water not reaching collection systems. So basically, if you're having severe wet weather, is it impacting your water supply, your sources, your storage, and your ability to channel off that water so that it does not impact your wells, for instance, flood your wells? So so we're going to look at how we manage that through natural treatment. And so this is one example of a watershed sustainability KPI. There's a lot more, but I just use this one example so you can see. Stakeholder consultation, or stakeholder understanding and support. So stakeholder consultation is number one. So this is our final attribute. So stakeholder contribution. Really, are we talking to our stakeholders? Now, stakeholders are not only going to be the customers, they're going to be the people who live in the area, the businesses that operate in the area, the media, the regulatory people, environmental groups. These are all considered stakeholders, and you're going to want to have communication with those people and involve them in the planning process. Things are going to go a lot easier when you get stakeholder buy-in. So stakeholder satisfaction, just the perceptions of the utility. Do they have good perceptions or bad perceptions? Internal benefits from stakeholder input. This really addresses the value that you get from involving the stakeholders and taking their input and implementing it in the plan so that you don't get pushed back down the road later if you try to push something through. Comparative rate rank. So how do your rates compare in terms of geographic region, size of population served, et cetera. So how do your rates really stack up? You know, are you doing something wrong where your rates are a lot higher, or are you too low? You know, so you can compare this by looking at the rates regionally and comparing it to similar geographic regions, size of population, and other factors that kind of give you an oranges to oranges comparison. So, or apples to apples, I guess I should say. So, media and press coverage. This is your portrayal in the media, newspaper, TV, radio. Um, for small water systems, it's probably the hometown newspaper. So that's what you're gonna. So you're gonna want to assess that in terms of awareness, how accurate the stories are, and the tone. Are they against you? Are they for you? And you want to keep them plugged in. So in partnering in the community, how the utility actively engages with the community organizations in advance to advance important initiatives. So, do we engage our community partners in decision making? And how is the utility positioned in the community as an anchor institution? So, are we involved in the community, or are we just hands off in the community? So that's important, especially for small water districts. The utility is going to be a big part of the community. All right, so let's look at some KPIs. Some of these are going to be numbers. Some of these are going to be just yes or no. So, stakeholder consultation, number of active contacts with stakeholders in key areas like government, business, education, non-governmental groups, and customers are still stakeholders too. So, stakeholder satisfaction. Overall satisfaction is 100 times the number of stakeholders who annually rate the overall job of the utility as positive, divided by total number of stakeholders served. So this would be an annual survey you could do, and I think that's probably important to determine the stakeholder satisfaction, so you know problem areas you might have. So you're really looking at the percentage of people that are not satisfied with the total number of people you surveyed. Internal benefits, that's 100 times the number of utility projects or activities where stakeholders participated and or provided input for which utility employees and believe there is value added as a result of stakeholder participation and input divided by the total number of projects where stakeholders participated and or provided input. So really what you're measuring here is the value of the stakeholder input. So how often do you get stakeholders involved, and how often are they providing you actually useful advice? So, and if they're not providing you useful advice, maybe you're not explaining things correctly. There are some things you can do to correct that. So, comparative rate rank, typical monthly bill for the average household as a percentage of typical monthly bills for similar utilities. So that would be one KPI to look at comparative rate rank. So are we eating up a bigger percentage of our customers' monthly household expenditures as opposed to similar utilities? That's one way to track the comparative rate rank. Media and press coverage, what we want to do here is we're basically just basically assessing the percentage of media stories that portray the utility in a positive way versus total media stories. You can look at accuracy too. You can look at the percentage of how accurate the stories are versus total stories. Number of ways to look at media coverage, and community partnering, number and type of specific projects completed associated with partnerships. Maybe rain gardens or different parks or things. These types of things, you can take detention ponds, you can make them into parks, and so this is a way to get community involved or have a picnic where everybody comes out and looks at the plans for the future, those types of things. All right, so we've covered all 10 attributes the last couple of weeks. This is really what that looks like, and hopefully you got a lot of that. A lot of that was word and number heavy, but it really is important to have a sustainably managed utility to consider all these areas. Obviously, some things like infrastructure and your water resource adequacy are going to be vital components and probably more important than some of these other ones, but they are all are important to sustainably manage your utility. I mean, you really want to have your customers buy in and your stakeholders buy in. That may seem like a minor one, but it is important. So, all right. So that is the show today. We will be back next Thursday with a new show. I look forward to that. And thank you very much for watching today.